Thank you very much indeed, John. I'm thoroughly intimidated by that introduction, but I'll try and live up to some of it. When Ricardo invited me along, I should state up front, I am not an architect, and I'm not an urban planner by training. I have none of the professional background that the various other speakers in this series will bring to the show. And I was contemplating, when Ricardo said, just talk about your experience of the city, and you think, what the hell can you say? I get up in the morning, I get on the bus, this is not going to be the most stimulating of talks. And then I thought, actually, over that 20-year period when I ran Neil Baxter Associates through in Glasgow, I had many occasions when I was working in various capacities in the City of Edinburgh, and those are indicative. I mean, this is all terribly self-indulgent. You suddenly realise, James, I'd forgotten I did that. And you drag out all the projects, some of which were abject failures, some of which were modestly successful, and some of which were actually reasonably successful, and you can see the outcomes, and I will endeavour to show you them. But what I thought was indicated in all of this was perhaps, and particularly I think the failures point up, I'm hoping that I'm not the common factor with all the failures. I think some of the failures pointed up a lack at that time, I'm not saying that this is the case now, but at that time, a lack of political direction on some of these projects, perhaps a lack of officer leadership on some of the projects, and I felt that they were all in their various ways indicative of just different attitudes, and hopefully much of that has changed, and I certainly detect a much more can-do attitude, particularly in this department. I would say that because John and I are involved in a sort of mutual flattery session here. But particularly in this department, there is much more will to change. It is odd because if I was to do, and I haven't done an empirical calculation on it, but I did get the feeling going back through my back catalogue of projects, and I worked variously, many times obviously in Glasgow, as John highlighted. I worked for the City of Birmingham, I worked in the City of Sunderland, I worked for the City of Leeds, I've done a number of jobs in other parts of Scotland, Aberdeen, Dundee. I did quite a lot of work in Edinburgh. And I'll just come on without any further. It is a little Edinburgh story. Now, the real backstory is that in point of fact, I arrived in this remarkably fine city, which we all know and love, in 1992, and I joined the RIS 1930 study. Now, my prehistory is up until 1992, I was studying art history and English literature at Glasgow University. I then specialised in architectural history, which led to an introduction to the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland. I won't go into all the gory details, but I came on board as part of the committee while I was still a student for the RIS 1930s study. So for all the students who keep battering at my door, please keep battering at my door, because sometimes good things come of this battering at the door. I have to say, my original battering at Charles McKean's door got me nowhere at all. And eventually, after a lot of haranguing, I eventually got a slightly begrudging phone call, and I absolutely know how he feels when you think, they'll make this call, and one should endeavour to be helpful to everybody who's trying to get a little bit of what tends to be a sort of fairly busy and harassed diary. And Charles phoned up, and it was obvious I was going to get a sort of 30-second call, and within the 30 seconds I mentioned somebody who he knew very well, who was Margaret Brodie, the late Margaret Brodie. And there's a sort of pause, and he said, how do you know Margaret Brodie? And I said, well, she was the architect, the site architect for the Glasgow Empire exhibition. This was the lady architect who masterminded the building of 150 pavilions and buildings of varying scales in the months between February 1937, when that exhibition was commissioned, and May the 3rd, 1938, when it was opened. 15 months, 150 structures, the tallest of which was 300 feet high, the largest of which was 5 acres in its ground coverage, and effectively the whole job up until the final month of its evolution was run by an indomitable lady architect. So I mentioned her name to Charles, and Charles said, but we know Margaret, she's a family friend. I didn't know any of that. So we got into a conversation, and the rest is history. So I arrived in 1982. I persuade the RIS that the Manpower Services Commission was giving money to research studies, and maybe they could pay me. And then maybe they could pay me as the supervisor of a research study, and then we'd get people in offices throughout Scotland, because I've always been a sort of small-scale empire builder. So we built an empire of 5 offices throughout Scotland. We conducted the 1930s study, which is now all part of the Royal Commission's archive. So there is a huge sort of decade-detailed study of every building that was built in Scotland during the 1930s period. They're all catalogued. They're all listed. It was all done on paper because we didn't have fancy computer gizmos at that time. Or we did, but they weren't WYSIWYG, whatever that means. Anyway, the first competition I was involved in was 1983, and I realised that the RIS needed some help in its competition administration, and I discovered that I actually have a natural administrative bent, to coin a phrase, and I helped organise the exhibition for the Allies and Morrison Mound competition. Now there is a case in point. Competition, major scale, internationally lauded, great design comes out of it, it is only partially implemented, and then the idea sort of fizzles out and drifts away, and one has to wonder why. Subsequently involved in various exhibitions, loads of competitions, but by 1988 I decided it was very much dead men's shoes, and how right I was in the RIS, so I headed off back to my home city and set up business in Glasgow. From 1988 until the first project in 1991 in Edinburgh, I was working through the West and wasn't really terribly closely involved in the city of Edinburgh. This is an oddity. The Edinburgh Academy had tried, I think they'd had 3 or 4 attempts to kick off a fundraising scheme for a new rugby ground and all sorts of facilities at Rayburn Place. So we organised the appeal for them, raised a significant amount of money, then started to be involved in the promotion of the school, and it was great from my point of view. I went to a comprehensive secondary school in Glasgow, and the number of Edinburgh people who'd come up to me and say, and when were you at the academy? And I would say, well, from 1972 to 1978. I didn't say it was Lindsay Academy I was at, not the Edinburgh Academy. There we are. They asked the question. And the reason for the termination scandal, I'm afraid we made the great mistake of publishing an image on a brochure that the parents of the Edinburgh Academy senior pupils felt was wholly inappropriate. It caused a huge scandal because it was sexually totally inadmissible, outrageous, a deplorable image, and it just suggested all the wrong things. I mean, can you imagine publishing that on a brochure about the achievement of school pupils? I mean, an image that is quite as disgusting as that. So we were duly sacked on the back of that. I mean, how much sex do they have in Edinburgh? I thought, but there you go. It was by a 6th-year girl at the school. What the hell is wrong with that? There were tits. So we'll, cancel your contract herewith. And actually, ultimately, I got this image was reused in a later brochure, and somebody else got sacked in the back of it. So Edinburgh Academy upholding virtuous conduct and no sex, please. We are from Stockbridge. Next, fruit lights, and apologies to Richard Murphy, he's not here, please nobody tell him that I've stolen his image. This is just the tail end, in fact I think it's a Graham Montgomery drawing, so I'd probably get permission. But this is just indicative of a project, and the client, Lothian Edinburgh Enterprise Limited, sculpture competition for Market Street. The idea was to create a lighting sculpture that would bring people visually, obviously in the dark winter nights, as it is tonight conjecturally, would bring people down Market Street and bring them into the new fruit market, signal the entrance to the new fruit market, which had been beautifully refurbished and recreated by Richard Murphy's good endeavours, along with his then business partner, Graham Montgomery. That project lasted from 1993 to 1994, and there's some relatively rapid narrative. That was the introduction of the proposed competition brief. It didn't get to the publication of the competition brief for reasons that I will come on to, and I'll try and be circumspect about the reasons, because otherwise I might get sued. You don't have to read all of that.